So today I just want to do an honest critique of Renaissance periodization, of their theories, of some of the practical implications to consider when actually applying their theories, and whether it really is the best method to put on muscle tissue. So before I get into the details, I just want to say that overall, I don't have really any major issues with Renaissance periodization as far as their theories. I think you have to be really careful when it comes to putting some of them in practice though. And I do think that it is a little bit more geared towards some of the beginner crowd. And I was going to kind of critique Renaissance periodization a little bit harsher, but I actually heard Mike himself say that. And I had never really heard that come out of his mouth, that his content and his training programs are really geared towards more of the recreational lifters. I mean, I don't even know that a lot of his followers have ever heard him really say this. So it's pretty interesting, and it really changed my perspective on Dr. Mike and on Renaissance periodization as a whole, because I thought it was really this thing that was geared towards advanced lifters and the most scientific and the best approach, when really it's really going to benefit the beginners way more, and Dr. Mike even really admits this.
I think one of the things I can put some sort of insight into, I was going to say clarification, but I'm not so sure I ever really said this into any podcasts, because like you accurately represented, most of my audience tends to be folks that are maybe not beginners, but definitely intermediates, and maybe more recreational than the folks that you generally deal with.
And so, I mean, that's really interesting, because taking that into account, I really can't judge Renaissance periodization too harshly, because I do think increasing volume is a great way for beginners to progress. That's probably the best way to apply progressive overload for a beginner. I think after 6 months to a year, though, at that point, you may be able to get better results from just adding weight or doing things slightly different than the way that RP typically recommends. So when it comes to the theories of Renaissance periodization, the two things I really want to dive into are, what is a full range of motion? What does that really entail? And the volume versus weight, and what does failure actually mean? So really, we need to get some definitions, okay? So what is a full range of motion, okay? Is it just getting from point A to point B? Because I can see someone squat ass to the ground, but that doesn't mean they're going to have any kind of good joint mobility. They could be using a number of different compensations to get there. So this is a topic that I covered on a recent interview I did with Zach Couples, who's a very respected therapist, a really good kind of mobility guy in the space. And this is what he had to say about that.
You brought up a good point, so I want to touch on that. Just because someone looks like they have good mobility doesn't mean they have relative motion. They could be expressing a lot of mobility in a few segments. And it could be like they have a hypermobile area in the spine that allows them to go all the way down. Or, to your point, they flatten the foot a lot, and that's what allows them to squat deep.
So is it really full range of motion if you're getting to an in-range position and you're only getting there because you have weight on top of your body and you can kind of do funky things to get there? Or is a full range of motion getting to a full range while keeping tension on the targeted muscles? I would think it's more of that. Because whenever you do a lot of this rib flaring and extension patterning that is recommended by RP Strength, you're going to actually lose time under tension on the target muscle. You're also maybe even losing stretch, because just because something's moving further in space, now we have stuff orienting in position to get there, and it's not really lengthened muscle tissue. So it'd be good to define what orientation is, okay, and relative motion. So orientation is just things grouping together. The most common things you'll see in bodybuilding is, let's say I'm doing like a really steep incline press, and as I'm pressing, I'm gonna just extend the ribs and arch the back to get there. That's a real common orientation pattern. Another really common one is on squats. You'll see someone go into a really big extension. Let's just grab the pelvis. I wasn't gonna use the pelvis, but it's the best way to visualize this. So orientation pattern would just be dumping forward as a unit when you start the squat to get extension, which is going to give you internal rotation capacity if you don't have it. And then once I get to 90 degrees or so, then it's just going to dump backwards into a posterior pelvic tilt, which would be a butt wink when your low back kind of rounds and your butt pulls under. So what we would want to happen instead of that orientation is we would want to have relative motion of the innominate bones to the sacrum. Okay, so relative motion is when things aren't moving chunked together, they're moving interdependent of each other. So they're not moving as a unit, but the movement influences the other one. So instead of just dumping forward into an anterior tilt, what we would want is the sacrum to go forward as these hip bones internally rotate behind. So we'd be in that position instead of just there. So the relative motion we would want to happen at our pelvis, instead of just dumping forward and dumping back, would be sacral nutation, where that sacrum tips forward and the innominate bones come around it, and then sacral nutation as we get to deeper range, where it tips back and these innominate bones externally rotate around the front part. So instead of here and here, we have the relative motion of the sacrum moving with the hip bones. And so if you're squatting so deep and all of a sudden you don't have that ability and you can only completely orient to get there and you no longer have counter nutation to get lower than 90 degrees, you should probably stop at 90 degrees, because then I'm just putting pressure on my low back. I'm going to take it off the quads. Kind of begs the question, like, does full range of motion really even matter? Which is kind of crazy to say, because I've been in the gyms now for 20 years. When I first started working out, I would see people doing these little weird partial ranges, all tight, really, really limited range of motion. That always encourage you, hey, let's get a deep stretch. Let's feel that in range. Now I go to the gym and I see these kids like in this extreme extension pattern, retracted shoulders, doing this crazy press because they're just trying to get the stretch. And I'm like, how did it go so far the other way? Let's close it down a little bit. And this happened to a few things in the gym industry. I remember before CrossFit came around, nobody squatted. I could go to a squat rack at 5 p.m. and I could get into any point I wanted to. Now, free weights and deadlifting and squats are everywhere. Everyone does it. And I remember when girls went to the gym to lose their fat asses instead of to get a fat ass. I mean, you tell your girl 20 years ago you got a fat ass, she's going to slap you. You tell her now, she go, oh, thanks, honey. I might not be able to bench press at 5 o'clock because every single girl is turning the bench press into hip thrust, but that's a trade I'm willing to make. I'll sacrifice bench press if it means we've got these girls looking like centaurs walking around the gym with these big asses hanging out in pants that are like made to accentuate it. But I digress. I'm sorry. I'm getting distracted. I know Mike tends to talk a lot about gay humor. I guess I talk about hetero humor. So does range of motion even matter? So I know a lot of you evidence-based guys are really big on the research studies, and honestly, I'm not at all, especially when it comes to anything to do with hypertrophy, because it's just impossible to actually control for the things you need to control for. It's impossible to tell who is actually a beginner, who's an intermediate lifter. Like, none of this stuff is really applicable. I think if you're going to really dive in and try to like nerd out on a subject, think about biomechanics, learn the ins and outs and the intricacies of that, because that's going to benefit you a lot more and have a lot more real world application than diving into all these exercise science studies, which really haven't provided us anything new or beneficial like in the last 30 years. Like, I don't know what we've learned that's new. Okay, maybe we reinforce some things we already knew, but we're not learning anything groundbreaking. But I do just want to pull up this one study real quick, and it's just a systematic review talking about different ranges of motion and how they relate to hypertrophy. And again, anything that is a hypertrophy related study is really hard to do. You don't know what these people are sleeping like, what they're eating like, all kinds of things. But if we look at these results here, we can see that there is a difference in hypertrophy on the quads when it comes to using a partial range squat from 0 to 60 degrees compared to 0 to 120 degrees. The 120 degrees got a lot more quad growth and other activation from other muscles. But if we look at another study that had the full range of motion at 140 degrees and the shortened range of motion at 90 degrees, there really was no difference at all in the quad musculature. There was more stimulation in the adductors and the glutes on the 140 degree squat, but that probably took away from some of the quad activation. So what we can see is, yeah, range of motion matters to a certain degree, okay? Once we start pushing past that, then we no longer get benefits to the targeted muscle. We may get other things involved, but it could be at the direct expense of what we're trying to hit. If we just look at the conclusion, current research suggests that performing resistance training through a full range of motion confers beneficial effects on hypertrophy. However, at least for quads, based on our interpretation of data, evidence applies that these benefits are apparent only until a certain range of motion threshold. So why are we told to just go as extreme as possible by the RP guys? I don't really know what that's based off of. It's important to keep in mind that if we are doing these different things to get like a bigger range of motion, whether it's arching our back a lot or having a lot of motion through one of our lumbar spine segments, this is going to affect your aesthetics negatively and also your range of motion. And this is some stuff I cover in the video where I critique Dr. Mike and his technique specifically. And this is not the same thing. I'm not trying to critique Dr. Mike's technique. You could look at that video for that. He does a lot of things I would say aren't optimal. This is really just about the Renaissance periodization theories and their theories on technique, and you can apply them different ways. Jared Feather actually applies them pretty effectively, and if you look at the video I made on Mike, you can see I cover, even though they have the same principles, they actually apply it differently and they don't work out with the same nuances. And Jared's actually talked about how him and Mike don't agree on everything. I don't think a lot of people think that. I think they just see Dr. Mike say things one way and that they just think that's it. So you're going to increase your chance of injury because you're losing range of motion, because as you kind of flare the ribs and extend your back, your exoskeleton has limited ranges of motion. It has to change to fit into the sockets, okay? So if you force range of motion, you actually lose range of motion because your exoskeleton has to accommodate the shape changes from the flared ribs and the dumped forward pelvis, and that actually ends up closing down your range of motion, which means you're going to lose lines of tension. You're going to lose muscles to potentially recruit from. You're going to increase your chance of injury. You're going to also make it so that you can't push as hard, and you're going to have to taper down the volume potentially to counter that. Another thing to think about is like, you know, a muscle is not just one thing. It doesn't stretch uniformly, okay? So it's not just about how far can I pull something from point A to point B, because muscles don't attach from point A to point B. They're all intertwined all along the way, and your rib position plays a really big factor in it. And this is another subject that I covered with Zach, and he had some really interesting thoughts on it. And I don't think a lot of Dr. Mike's followers, and I know Dr. Mike doesn't know this either, but I don't think a lot of people understand this concept, and it's really important to get across because it can help you get total pec development. Because if you're only doing things always that retracted way, you're only going to develop certain areas of your pecs and you're going to miss out on full development. So let's listen to this real quick.
And this goes back to dead guy anatomy.
Dead guy anatomy is a term that we use in the rehab world, referring to kind of the traditional models of anatomy and how the body moves, and it doesn't really apply. It carries over to the bodybuilding world a lot. You see a lot of people say things that it's just not the way the body really works.
Most people look at any type of lift. They look at one attachment and then they look at the other attachment, and they don't look at anything in between that could potentially influence contractility. You know, and the dirty little secret is your muscles do not contract uniformly across the entire muscle. And that's an evidence-based statement. They've done studies where they've demonstrated that. Let's think about that in the case of muscles that run along the rib cage. I think pecs are an easy example of this. Like, if I do something that brings the chest forward, that might put a stretch locally on the pec here, and if I pull the shoulder down and back, that could affect the pec at the humeral attachment. But what about all this stuff here along the chest? How do I get that to expand, open up, and get a stretch? So I think it's a thing that a lot of people gloss over because they're only looking at trying to pull two ends as opposed to trying to create an action across the whole muscle itself. And I mean, you can apply the same thing with the lats. You can honestly apply the same thing with any of the abdominal musculature.
So your ribs play a huge role in actually getting a true stretch and actually getting true range of motion. I mean, my pecs are my best body part. They have always been that way, and I've always intuitively lifted with this stack and had those ribs under control. And you can see it in my development. And anytime I train anyone who's been working out that one style and we switch to getting rib control and actually getting full contractions, their pecs become so much fuller and they get so much more definition as well. If this is how you're pressing on an incline, okay, well, don't do that on every single press you do, because then you're only going to develop those fibers. It's not going to develop evenly. Make sure we do some with rib control. So what is a good example of going to full range of motion and what's not? It's kind of funny, but I'm going to use Dr. Mike as an example of what is like not going to full range of motion the appropriate way. And then I'll use Jared Feather and also use my man Robin Strand to show you exactly what it looks like getting to full range of motion without tons of crazy compensations that are going to actually cost you gains and potentially give you injuries down the road. All right, so we have Mike doing this incline Smith press, and what you got to pay attention to is look at this whole rib cage, this whole thorax. It's moving up in space and back in space as he's pressing. So he's actually shortening his range of motion. So he's taking a lot of tension off the pecs and just putting it on his connective tissue. I mean, this is essentially turned into a full body movement instead of having some control and making those pecs actually work. So this is not a good thing. You don't see a lot of contraction at all from the pecs. You see him actually moving in space. When we look at Jared, we don't see that same movement at all. We see much more control. You can't get the same angle, so you can't see his ribs, but I guarantee you they're moving a little better. Here's my man Robin, who will go all the way down, good range of motion. You can really see, look at his ribs. Look at this movement in the pecs. Like you can see they are not stuck flare. They're actually moving down as he presses. And then we'll see Dr. Mike on this incline. You see the same thing. You see the ribs just orienting. The sternum is just orienting. That is all that is. That is taking so much away from the pecs. So yeah, you're holding the dumbbells low, but again, you're just resting on connective tissue. You're just resting in the back of your scapula. Here's the pressed scapula. Again, look at the difference in contraction. Yeah, it's not the same huge range of motion, but that is an active range of motion. That's going to be way more beneficial for us as bodybuilders. Let's look at the chest press. Again, we see a really just kind of passive stretch at the end range. And what I mean by that is passive on the connective tissue, passive just holding the scapula back. And the ribs, again, these bucket handle ribs, they stay flared the whole time, which is not a good sign for activation of the pecs, especially these lower and middle fibers. Here we see Robin. Look at these ribs. Really good control. Look at the contraction you actually see in the pecs. And then we're going to look at a little bit of a side view so you can see like what the range of motion looks like. And it's not a crazy range where he's just sitting in this like in range with no tension. He's actually keeping tension the whole time. And I mean, mechanical tension is the main driver for hypertrophy no matter what. So why would we force a range of motion where we lose mechanical tension? And on here we see Dr. Mike, he's in this duck foot position to get as much depth as he can on this leg press, and he's going to round his back and his butt's going to come up. Like, that's terrible. That is really risky for your low back. Dr. Mike has crazy erectors. If you've never seen them, I mean, they're nuts because they have to be. They do so much for him. But if this is the only way you get to that depth, then you probably shouldn't be going there. Like, if you want your quads, these would be a little straighter and you wouldn't be quite going so deep because you don't simply have that. That is just stuff getting smushed. Just letting the weight pull you there. And here we see Robin, toes are straighter, keeping tension on the actual quads. Don't have the butt winking. This is a full range of motion. Again, full range of motion isn't just how far does something go from point A to point B. You can use anything to get there. This is much better. And people who are real big RP nut huggers might say that his gains would be better if he forced some range of motion, which couldn't be further from the truth. Whenever you force range of motion, you also sacrifice potential separation. Again, because it's going to the connective tissue. You have more things moving as a unit instead of things having isolated tension on them. You're going to sacrifice separation. Look at any powerlifter. Look at their back double. No separation. Look at their back lat spread. Crazy good back lat spread because they got those erectors. They won't have the details in the pecs. They'll be missing the separation in the shoulders. So how can we tell if we're going through excessive range of motion? Well, one, you will lose your intra-abdominal, intrathoracic pressure. It'll get to the point where you can't keep any kind of a stack. And again, you're going to lose some of it. You're not trying to keep 100% relative motion. Then you won't be able to produce as much force. There's a trade-off. You just don't want to go too far on the spectrum. So try to keep a stack as you're doing your presses, as you're doing anything. And then if you're doing leg work, really think about the contact points of your under your big toe and on the inner heel and under your pinky toe. Make sure you don't lose those and be heavier on those inner contact points. And a lot of times that'll keep you from orienting at the pelvis. You can also think like, where am I naturally going to stop if I wasn't loaded? Okay, so if I'm doing a chest press in my natural position, I feel comfortable right here, right before I hit my chest. Like, that's a stretch position. If I load myself and push further, now I'm on other stuff. It's just kind of like holding a passive stretch on stuff that's not even on the muscle. So if I'm squatting, you can't body weight squat ass to the grass. You shouldn't be squatting ass to the grass with weight on your back because it's just pushing you down. I mean, I think that everybody understands that the stretch is important, but you also don't have to get it on every single movement. If you're doing a pec day, your pec fly, let that be the main stretch movement. You'll get a good stretch on other things, but it's okay. If you did a floor press, but you had some pec flies like an incline dumbbell, they're a little more of a stretch focus, that's totally fine. You can focus on a little more of the contraction. I know Dr. Mike now says there's no real good point of in-range contraction and squeezing, but I think he used to be really big on it, I heard. And every good bodybuilder ever really has talked about how important the squeeze is. You hear people talking about it being what brings out striations all the time. It's something that Milo says all the time, but since there's no evidence-based research around it, it's going to be hard for some of Mike's fans, some of the RP guys to buy in, but it's something that is pretty well accepted. I'm going to play a quick clip of Milo's talking about it, in fact.
You had it at the Goals Venice. You know, that last part was the hardest part.
He's talking about using a leg extension, getting the in-range contraction on that.
And then as I started doing it, I lock in and hold for a couple of seconds. Each workout, like, oh shit, look at this. I'm seeing it more and more and more. So
seeing striations. So Milos is talking about how really squeezing the in-range of contraction helps with the details. And yeah, it's probably not going to help build as much muscle as doing the in-range and the stretching portion, but I really do think it helps with the details, and people have been saying this for 50 years.
So when they start appearing, right, I start squeezing the shit out of them. And it's the same thing across the chest, right? You squeeze a little bit, but squeeze like a maniac. I mean, a lot of people, just squeeze somewhat. So when he came and trained with me at like 91, and we start training, and then I say, squeeze, and then he looked at me, what for?
And I think that's how a lot of Dr. Mike fans feel sometimes. That's how they responded on the last video I said. But there are real benefits, but they just haven't been proven in studies. And if you're always going to wait for something to come out in a study, you're going to be lagging behind by like a lot.
Robbie was trying to tell me this, and I was in so much pain. I wasn't trying to squeeze nothing. I was just.
And like I said, it makes things harder. As a bodybuilder, like I said, you want to make everything hard as possible. Squeezing is going to make it harder.
That shit hurt.
You get the quality, 1,000,000% for sure.
Keep squeezing. So in theory, I would love to be a part of Team Full Range of Motion, but in practice, a lot of times I find that people are sacrificing actual tension on the muscles and their joint integrity to get to some arbitrary range of motion that they think is needed because RP Strength recommends it. So if you can't get there, don't force it, all right? You should actually feel tension. You should never feel your joints. As a bodybuilder, that's something you should never, ever feel. And we'll get into that later. I know that's something that they put on the app too. Now let's talk about how RP recommends increasing volume by increasing the set number as their main form of progressive overload versus increasing the weight. And as you saw earlier, Mike even admits this really isn't the best protocol for more advanced lifters. So I'm going to go back to that discussion that he was having with Dr. Scott Stevenson, because Scott is a much smarter man than me. He's got a PhD as well as Dr. Mike, and he can explain things much better. So let's listen to them, and then we'll have some comments.
What I suspect that I have gleaned is that the context of the level of experience of the bodybuilding trainee is what people are not picking up on, and that is that things are different when you're 1 year in or 2 years in even.
I think Dr. Scott was being nice by throwing that extra year in there. I really think that he feels the same way as I do, that after a year you're still increasing by volume in sets instead of increasing weight, you're probably not optimizing your gains.
Compared to when you've been training for a decade or 20 years,
20.
Or more than 30 like me. So the type of progressive overload that I favored over time has been based sort of on the idea that form follows function, and that you're going to have to get stronger in order to get larger to some degree. Obviously, it's not a one-to-one strength and muscle size relationship, but that progressive overload should, in some way, shape, or form, entail using heavier loads. This is over the course of years, and that the biggest bodybuilders are jumping the strongest bodybuilders.
I mean, if you look at the biggest bodybuilders, the most dense muscular ones, this is true. They all pretty much did progressive overload. I mean, you got exceptions. You got a guy like Jay Cutler, who was a volume guy, never went super intense, who was also just a fucking freak of nature at the age of 19, you know. I think he could have done anything and turned into just a monster. But you look at guys like Mike Francois, Luke Sandel was amazing. I mean, Dorian Yates obviously was a proponent of high intensity. He was a skinny guy naturally. He became the biggest guy of all time during his heyday. Who else? We got Jordan Peters, who's another guy that just packed on slabs of muscle, who was not genetically a gifted or huge guy. And then, of course, you got the biggest human of all time, Ronnie Coleman. So, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. The biggest bodybuilders on earth do tend to be some of the strongest.
Doesn't always work out exactly for everyone. It made sense to me because if you look at reasons why this is sort of a teleological argument, why would a muscle grow and increase contractile protein? Well, in some way, shape, or form, the tensile demands on that skeletal muscle have become greater. So you can adapt to a muscular endurance type of stress by an enzymatic adaptation, mitochondrial adaptation, increasing glycolytic enzymes, those sorts of things, which you'll see in some of the studies. So you see those adaptations, unlike what someone who might be doing like a strict DC training, which could be high volume depending on how you warm up. So anyway, the bottom line there that I'm getting at is that I've always favored progressive overload, where the focus with logbooking and mentality has been to train as hard as you possibly can with as much volume as you can. That's what I've included in my training system, which differs from DC, in a way that manifests in getting as strong as possible.
So there's Dr. Scott Stevenson, and he trained with John Meadows for many years. He trained David Henry throughout his career, and he's really big on intense training, but he's also a big fan of volume. And they were talking about DC training there, which is a pretty low volume program. So really the only difference that he has with Dr. Mike is that he thinks that weight should be the first priority versus increasing by sets.
Great stuff, Scott. So, I think one of the things
So this is the clip I played earlier of Dr. Mike.
I can put some sort of insight into, I was going to say clarification, but I'm not so sure I ever really said this in too many podcasts, because like you accurately represented, most of my audience tends to be folks that are maybe not beginners, but definitely intermediates, and maybe a bit more recreational than the folks that we generally deal with. When you get to be really big and strong, man, you just kind of weight or maybe reps is kind of the only thing left, because progressing through sets is just unrealistic. Your volume landmarks just too close together. You just won't recover from any more, any less. It's just not enough.
So what Dr. Mike's saying there is, as you get more advanced, it's kind of like your minimum effective volume isn't that much different than your maximum effective volume. So you can't really use adding sets as a way to progressively overload. You're going to have to add weight and maybe a rep here and there, which, I didn't know Dr. Mike said these things. I thought he was like 100% volume is the best answer. And it's refreshing to see that he puts it out there that is not the best answer for everybody.
You're like, well, this is fucking stupid. There's no way for me to avoid just using more weight on sets, right? So I think that because I talk to this population here, beginners and intermediate a lot, we do a lot of cycling by sets and always cycling with weight, of course, getting stronger. I think the population maybe you're talking to a little bit more, the elite guys up here, a lot of those options are just not options for them. But how many guys would turn you down?
And I like I said, I do think increasing volume is probably optimal for the beginner. You're going to get stronger neurally anyway, so the weight's just going to go up just from you getting better at patterning. It takes such little volume to stimulate in the beginning that you got a lot of room to improve just by focusing on adding that.
Down and be like, wait a minute, I can go like 4 reps shy of failure and do just a bunch more sets, and I can still grow with 0 injury risk pretty much. You'd be like, yeah. You're like, well, fuck, get me started. The thing is, a lot of those guys, after...
I do think one of the reasons that RP emphasizes the reps in reserve and the not going to failure and progressing by volume versus progressing by weight is they're almost like overly scared of injuring themselves. I hear Mike say this a lot, that is to prevent injury, but realistically, if you are training full range of motion with the appropriate stack and the relative motion, your range of motion should be getting better. It shouldn't be getting worse. You shouldn't really be at risk of getting injured. I do take most everything to failure, and I've never had a joint issue at all. When I was younger, maybe up to about 5 or 6 years ago, I would get some back pain and some neck pain every now and then, just really acute, just a little tightness. But now that I really understand things a little bit better as far as the whole picture, I don't have any issues. You should never be thinking about your joints or that you're at risk for some kind of injury while you're working out. It's a very controlled environment. And another thing that I don't really understand about their fear of injuring yourself or really fatiguing yourself too much by going to failure is like, why not just go to failure on like a hamstring chest press? Maybe don't go to failure on an incline barbell press, but I'm pretty sure you can handle pushing yourself to failure on a hamstring chest press or on a tricep push down on a cable. Like, there's certain things that are going to affect you that negatively going to failure. So I don't know why it's applied like across the board.
For 3 weeks, they'll be like, how do you feel? They're like, I just feel tired. Like, did you get bigger? They're like, no. They're like, well, I guess it didn't work. So I think there's definitely something to say for those differences. And I wonder what you think about all that rationale.
Those guys probably don't recognize what you just said, the context of who you were speaking to, in terms of.
I mean, I didn't realize Scott's talking about people who really disagree with Mike and argue with him don't understand the context of who he's speaking to, and I really didn't either.
Manipulating volume to produce the progressive overload to produce muscle size gains. That whole clip right there, it may be one that could be bookmarked for many, many people.
So people that tend to be more fast twitch dominant and people that tend to be more advanced probably benefit a little bit more from not changing volume by set numbers much as they go over weeks of training, but adding load preferentially. In addition to that, there's some good reasoning to think that faster twitch muscle fibers respond better to just absolute load increases as a way of growing than metabolites, lactic acid, and stuff like that, because they have a very low volume.
So that's really interesting, because really as bodybuilders, we mainly care about fast twitch muscle fibers. That's what we want to grow. They're significantly larger. So if they respond a lot better to just direct increases in weight versus volume and other mechanism of hypertrophy, why don't we prioritize that?
Only window of adaptation, and doing a bunch of drop set burnout shit probably doesn't work that well with them. Individuals that are more fast twitch dominant and advanced, they're just like gonna have to bench the 150s on incline dumbbell press 1 week, and then the next week they're just gonna have to do like the 155s or some shit, or add a rep maybe, and then next week 155s, and then they're gonna be like, coach, how do I get my chest bigger? You're like, I guess you just have to bench the 170s at some point. It's the only way it's gonna happen.
So honestly, this is refreshing, because I didn't know Dr. Mike said this kind of stuff.
Whereas for folks in more intermediate ranges, they can certainly add weight to the bar, but they can also add sets and stuff like that, and even add reps. And it's okay because they're not as fast twitching, not as advanced. They still get really great progress like that.
So Dr. Mike is basically saying that it is better to progress by weight if you're intermediate or advanced. If you're a beginner, volume is probably more appropriate. And I can't say I really have any kind of argument with that at all. Now, when it comes to the way that they use reps in reserve, I think it would be beneficial to, again, identify and define what is failure, the way we try to identify what is a true full range of motion. So what is true failure? What are we talking about here? Because this could be perceived very differently by the individual. For me, failure for me is mechanical failure. So if I'm doing a bench press, call it, I'm trying to keep my stack, keep relative motion. As soon as I start to arch, as soon as anything wants to get like a little bit off, I'm done. Okay, I could crank out one more rep for sure, maybe two if I really start to orient a little bit, but I'm going to stop right there, right when I know that is all I have with good form. Okay, you could have somebody who goes a little bit wonky where, say they do one extra rep, so their failure is they get a little bit of an arch, they get a little bit of a shift to finish, and then they're done. Okay, so they could have got one more rep if they lifted their ass off and pressed it. And then you get those people who just take failure to the point where every fucking thing's working, they're just shaking, everything is trying to move that bar, their butt's in the air, their head is about to explode, and for them it's not failure unless they have no ability to move any other muscle fiber in their body at that point. So how you approach failure has a lot to do with how you're approaching reps in reserve, right? So honestly, I think if you just approach it the way I do, mechanical failure, you can pretty much take everything to failure, maybe leave 1 or 2 reps in reserve tops. Now, there has been some studies on this, and again, like I said, I'm not a big studies guy, but let's just look at it for you evidence-based people who are really interested in that. So this is from Helms, right? Application of the repetitions in reserve-based rating of perceived exertion scale for resistance training. So it's about reps in reserve. And again, when it comes to reps in reserve, it's pretty arbitrary, especially for a beginner. How do you really define what that is? And how do we even really know what it is? Because sometimes, I like just the other day, I was doing 315 on bench press, and I felt really weak, and I did like 5 reps, and I thought I had one more rep in me tops. I was like, shit. And then someone was around, so I had a guy spot me, and I got 7 reps with no spot. I could have done probably 8 with a little bit of help. So I thought I was at my failure point, and really I had 2 more reps in me. So we don't always know. We don't always have the right perception of what is true failure. So the conclusion they ended up coming to this was advising using repetitions in the rep range from 6 to 12 with the reps in reserve of 0 to 2. And here they actually talk about what I was just saying, how it's perfectly fine to go to failure on movements that are low biomechanical complexity and low risk of injury. So here they recommend keeping the reps in reserve to 2 or under for maximum hypertrophy. They do say 2 to 4 is fine to mitigate fatigue and things like that. So at the end of the day, I think if you really want to progress by volume, you can. It might not be quite as optimal by weight, but don't progress by volume because you're afraid about overtraining, because if you work out too intensely, your body won't recover. If you work out with good form, that's not going to happen. Worry about not having shitty technique and having good biomechanics, and then you don't have to worry about mitigating your recovery by changing the volume that you're doing. You can work out as hard as you want without really having to worry about it. Like, wouldn't that be nice? Another thing that they say at RP a lot is that doing the higher volume is easier on the joints than going heavy and going to failure. That is not always the case. It really depends on what your specific mechanics are. Like, a lot of times overuse is more of an issue than taking a heavy load. It just really depends on what your situation is. Than taking the heavy load. That's not gonna, I hope no one clips that out. So I know that RP doesn't really recommend going to failure or using weight as a primary driver of progressive overload. So I had to do a little bit more research into like what they actually are about. And it's pretty interesting on this article. Basically, they tell you how everything can work. As long as you're between 30% of your 1 rep max and 85%, you're doing between 5 reps per set and 30 reps, and you're between 4 reps and 0 reps away from failure, you're going to grow. So that leaves a lot of options. So it's kind of interesting how there's so much option. They even say this, but still there's this thought process. And I don't know if it's them driving it, but it's like that this is the best way, and this is really the preferred and almost the only way. And I know there are studies saying that volume is king, but again, like I said, I don't buy into any kind of hypertrophy-based study. It's hard to test the individual variables, and you can't really test one thing against the other. And I don't actually, I don't think Mike even really likes the Schoenfeld study. I think I've heard him talk negatively about it, but it's like, that's one of the big studies that people use for justifying volume, and that is just god awful for so many reasons. If you haven't looked into the issues with that, please do. But volume is fine, but I wouldn't say volume is king the way RP says. Okay, so when I was reading through this, there was a couple things that stuck out to me. It's just like a little convoluted, but it's fine. There are people that like this. That is all good. If you really want to get like nerdy and make something a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, it's because you like it. I get it. I do that a lot. I'm the same way. I'm a Virgo. I do that kind of thing a lot. So one thing that I thought was kind of weird on here, that was kind of silly, is the way that they say you can find your minimum effective volume is basically waste a lot of time start with some amount of volume, and at the end of the week, if you progress, lower your volume until you get to the point where you're not progressing. So it's like, I don't really know why you'd waste time to get some silly objective like measure on here. It's not like it's going to really pay off in the long run. And here are some things that they put into the app too. I think some things have changed as well. I know that in the app, they ask you for things like your pump, and I think it scores differently, and like it adds sets if your pump is like not that good and takes away sets if your pump is too good, or I'm not really sure. I think it's really kind of objective because a lot of things can give you a pump. Maybe you just went to Panda Express and you got a lot of sodium. You're going to get a way better pump now than you did the last workout. Maybe this workout you took a little extra caffeine, so now you don't quite get the same pump. I think it's kind of a weird non-objective measurement to use to try to be like hyper precise with something. I don't know. It doesn't really make that much sense to me. And again, I don't know like why if you have a good pump, you're going to take off volume. Like that's not a bad thing. I know they also basically just ask you how challenged were you overall, which is kind of weird because again, that could play into a lot of things. You know, was your recovery? Did you sleep good? Are you stressed? Did the session make you sore? So they're using like all these different kind of weird non-objective measurements, like I said, to get something really specific. They're trying to give you your workout volume based off of that. And I think there are a lot better measures to see if you recovered well. You know, you could look at your heart rate variability. You could look at your sleep. You could look at your resting heart rate. You could talk about your digestion. You could just talk about your mood, how you're feeling, your stress levels. There's a lot of, I would say, better ways than just you trying to say, oh, I'm sore, or oh, I feel this way. And I know that they also use joint pain as a metric as well, and they adjust volume based off of that, which I think is so silly. I think it's so like outdated. This is a pretty expensive app, and I think it would be way better, way more beneficial if instead of like you saying, okay, I got joint pain, I had a highest grade possible on this. Well, they're gonna, I don't know if they change the exercise or the lower the volume. It'd be nice if they like came up with some solutions to actually help fix your joint pain. Maybe we looked at the connective tissue. Maybe we do some joint specific training, maybe just mobility specific training. So we don't just manage it by kind of putting a Band-Aid on it. We actually fix the problem. But again, I don't think that's the kind of thing that they do over here. Hey, you need someone on your app who can help you do that? Reach out to me. I can show you exactly what's up, okay? If you can't do your bench press because your elbow's bugging you, let's look at your pronation, your internal rotation setup. Let's see if you've got rib expansion. Let's do a couple tests, and then let's not try to lower the volume right away. You might just take 5 minutes of doing a couple repositioning moves, and now you can do the same movement without pain instead of having to change your whole volume for the rest of your mesocycle. If this sounds too complicated, it is kind of complicated. For beginners, does it need to be this complicated? Not really, but if this is what you like, it's fine. I don't think there's anything bad about it. Just seems like, I don't know, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, the way that they arbitrarily assign points to certain things, and these are all just very subjective things. So I'm not really on board with that, but that doesn't really tie into their overall theory. That's just kind of what they use for their algorithm for their app. So while I don't like that, doesn't really take away from the fact that most of the theory is pretty good. I don't really have any issues with most of it. If you just start getting joint pain and it's not from like a novel movement, then you have an issue you need to address. You don't need to just overlook it and try to mitigate the volumes. Like, I never feel my joints ever, but I did feel my elbow a couple weeks ago. And if you look on my video I made about the WEC method, I've been doing a lot of stuff with the club. So I'm swinging around a club. It's all brand new. So I felt tiny bit of elbow twinge, and it didn't really freak me out because it's a totally novel movement. I maybe not have the capacity for it right now. It's totally new. So I just did a couple things mobility wise, and I built up the capacity. Now it doesn't bother me. So if you're getting just joint pain out of nowhere from stuff you've been doing forever, that means you're getting too compressed and you're running out of space, and you have to address that. You're not just gonna build capacity to something you've been doing already. Like I said earlier, don't worry about overtraining and pushing too hard. Just worry about your form, your technique. And I wanted to do this critique because Renaissance Periodization just has such a large reach. And again, I'm not bad mouthing them. I don't think anything they do is terrible, but I think the fact that they reach so much people, we need to be able to look at it with a critical lens and really be analytical about what they do. We need to be able to have a critical analysis of RP strength just because they're so huge. I mean, I had no idea how big they were. I'm old. Back in the day when I was watching YouTube for entertainment, I was watching Greg Plitt, RIP, and Elliot Hulse, who I think is like a cult leader now or something. So I had no clue. I'm not really in the world. Everything I watch is bodybuilding content or it's related to movement, physical therapy, and that world. So Dr. Mike's pretty new to me. I had no idea how big his reach was, and I think that's a perfectly fine thing. I think that's great. I think he helps a lot of people, but I just want to make sure that we're optimizing the theories that RP presents. So I was thinking about this video today. I knew I was gonna make it later, and I was listening to my guy Hormozy, who I wouldn't say he's a friend, he's an acquaintance. I do have him in my cell phone. He's a cool guy. I saw this clip of him talking about educational content versus entertainment content and edutainment content, which is kind of in the middle. And that's really what I would classify Dr. Mike and RP Strength as edutainment. Like, Dr. Mike's pretty entertaining. He puts out a lot of content and some good info, but it's not always the most beneficial for everybody because it's going to be very general. So Hormozy was talking about this morning and it just really registered with me and really made me think about Renaissance periodization. I don't know if you guys will get the same kind of vibe that I do, but tell me if this makes sense to you.
So if I educate a wide slice of people, there's still already people who know that thing and then do not get value. So entertainment, by definition, will always be greater or larger, the followings for those people, than people who educate.
So basically, let's use Dr. Mike and myself for an example. Dr. Mike is an edutainer. I wouldn't say he's an educator or an entertainer. He's an edutainer, and I'm an educator. So you go to him, you're going to get a lot of entertainment and some education. You go to me, you get some education and maybe a little entertainment if you're really lucky. So he's got to be a lot more general because he's got a lot more general audience.
There is no bones about it. Like, it is that way. And so a lot of the lessons that entertainment teaches, everyone listens to because they have the biggest followings. But I don't think the actual tactics they subscribe or espouse are correct at a tactical level. At a principle level, yes.
I mean, it's pretty dead on with the way I feel about RP Strength is they're going to reach a lot of people and the principles are really on point, but the tactical way they go about them, or at least Dr. Mike, it might not be the best. So overall, I think RP Strength is fine. I think it's got like somewhat of a cult following for some people for some reason. I don't really know why. It's not like you're seeing people with the most insane results ever following this. This is stuff that people have done forever. It's nothing new. I do think a lot of people have actually taken it too far and they've harmed their gains by not going to progressive overload or by forcing too big of a range of motion or just being afraid to really push themselves. But overall, I can't say I disagree with anything that they promote because they are scientific based. There's nothing that they do that is wrong based off of the science, but I just don't think it's optimal. So my closing points would be, if you do RP Strength, great, it's fine. I would probably try to increase by weight instead of volume by the 6 month to the year mark, especially. You're going to get better results, probably. You're not going to hurt yourself, learn how to use good technique. Stop forcing a huge range of motion, okay? Just do what feels natural, where you actually feel tension on the muscle, and don't willingly give up your ribs and don't willingly go into excessive extension. At least not all the time. If you do that on one thing, don't do it on everything. Make sure that your body has other options because eventually you're going to run out of them. You're going to lose joint mobility. You're going to lose the ability to load lines of tension. You're going to have to manage your potential joint pain just by lowering the volume, and that's really going to make you suffer. You're going to lose some gains doing that. So hopefully this was in better taste than the video I did of Mike. I know that put off a lot of people. I was just in that type of mood when I did that. I really want to reach some of you guys who are hardcore RP followers because I know you guys are really passionate, and I do think that you could get a little bit of gains just by tweaking a couple little things. All right, so I appreciate it, you guys watching. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. I'm always up for a good debate as well. If you're willing to be like somewhat respectful, you don't have to be the most respectful. Just don't be a jackass, and you actually have some valid points. As you can see at the Mike video, I left all the comments up there that had anything valid to say. If you were just someone who was like, you fucking suck, you're ugly, well then I took you off. But if you had anything, even if it was super critical, that was worth discussing, then I left it there because I want everyone to benefit from the discussion. So please leave it below. All right, thanks. Appreciate it.